G'day everybody, my name is Nick and welcome to the first of two quick videos on how to ace QCE. These videos are based on the free ATAR Notes lectures which we ran recently at QUT. If you couldn't make the lecture, the point of these videos is to give you a general recap of what we covered and what you missed. Of course, there's no substitute for being there in person, meaning that you can ask questions and get that kind of one-on-one feedback. However, hopefully we'll give a decent overview of what you missed. If you did make the lectures, fantastic. Good to not see you again, but good to be with you again. This video will give you kind of a revision of what we covered on the day. There'll be two videos. This first video is on the technical side of QCE, things like what the ATAR is, how it's calculated, Polyrank, subject scores, your assessments, things like that. And then the second video in this series will focus more on things like study tips, study strategies, things that you can implement now to set yourself up for a really good Year 12 and to get fantastic marks. Before I get into it in too much detail, just want to give a really quick overview of ATAR Notes for those people who are unfamiliar with the brand or unfamiliar with ATAR Notes. Basically what we do at ATAR Notes is we try to make QCE as easy as possible and the transition to QCE really smooth for you. And to do that, we have a really big focus on free resources, which of course everybody loves. So we have free notes, and these lectures we typically run 4 times per year in school holiday periods. We have a free forum online where you can ask questions and get help with any of your subjects, free videos, free newsletters, so on and so forth. As you can see, there are very many resources here, some of which I'll go through in a little bit more detail later on, but that's the general point of ATAR Notes. We've been doing this in Victoria and New South Wales, where the ATAR exists for very many years, and now with the introduction of the ATAR to Queensland, we're really excited to be able to help basically a brand new generation of students. By way of introduction, my name is Nick. Naturally, I work for ATAR Notes. I graduated a few years ago now with an ATAR of 99.65, which may mean something to you or may be totally meaningless at this stage. That's totally fine. We'll go through what that means in due course. After high school, I went to university straight away, did a Bachelor of Arts focusing on linguistics. Here's my dog called Neville. He's a cavoodle, just over 1 year old. He's my first dog, so I'm low-key obsessed with him. If you have any questions at all, I'll be more than happy to answer them about my dog or otherwise at the end of this lecture recording on the ATAR Notes forums. Now, on the day of the actual lecture at QUT, we had 3 different content blocks. So block 1 was focusing on the ATAR system, what it means, how it will affect you. Block 2, we had a really good discussion based on a QUT student panel, where students could ask questions about different courses, the transition to university, how they can prepare, things like that. And then block 3 was essentially how to get a good ATAR based on my study tips. As I mentioned off the top, this video will focus basically on block 1, and the next video will focus on block 3. As we don't have the QUT panel available, we'll skip through block 2. So what is the ATAR exactly? Some of you may be super familiar with it, others not so much. Either way, that's totally fine. The transition from the OP to the ATAR, so the overall position to the ATAR system, came with a lot of social commentary, as you can probably see from some of these headlines. The one that really concerned me, though, or the one that stuck with me most, was this particular one on screen at the moment. So Queensland ATAR system forcing students to drop subjects, jeopardizing university placement. That's not a good thing, right? If people are changing their subjects or changing their career ambitions or lowering their expectations or whatever else, just because of the change from the OP to the ATAR, that's not what we want. Right? That's not what teachers want. That's not what the administrative bodies want. That's not what students or parents want. And so the point of this particular presentation isn't to give you like secrets on the ATAR that aren't publicly available or anything like that. The point is more to give you a basic overview of what you can expect, what the changes mean for you, and essentially the game that you're now playing in. And to be really clear, you don't need to know any of this information that I'm about to go through in great depth in order to do well, right? You don't need an intricate understanding of the QCE system or the ATAR or anything like that in order to get really great marks. And equally, having a really intricate understanding doesn't guarantee you those high marks, right? The advantage of knowing this stuff is in the fact that you no longer need to worry about it. So you might hear a lot of like rhetoric or rumor about what things mean or what they don't mean, or how things are calculated or scaling, what impact that will have, and things like that. But if you actually understand the system, at least on a basic kind of fundamental level, then you can focus on things which are actually important, such as, studying for your subjects. So what is the ATAR? Essentially, the ATAR is a single number which gives some kind of indication of overall QCE performance. Now, the idea of the ATAR is to make it easier on universities and other tertiary institutions to basically rank students based on their high school performance. Now, unis and other tertiary institutions have a set number of places that they can offer to students, right? They can't just say, everybody who wants to do medicine, we'll give 400, 500, 600, 700 offers for those courses merely based on demand. They don't have the capacity to do that. So they need to prioritize their offers. And a really easy way for them to do that is based on essentially high school performance. It makes sense. Now, to do that, they kind of need one single number, and that's where the ATAR comes in. So according to QTAC, the ATAR is the primary mechanism used nationally, which is already an advantage over the OP, which was not a national system, used nationally for tertiary admissions, and it indicates a student's position relative to other students. And this is really how I encourage you to perceive the ATAR. Basically as a way, just one way, to get into certain university or tertiary courses. Its utility after that is actually pretty limited, right? So it's not the case that in 1 year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years from now, all of your conversations will be based around the ATAR or anything like that, right? Even at universities, speaking about ATARs is really, really unusual and rare. So I encourage you to perceive the ATAR as one potential pathway and not to consider it as something more like this, which is just factually incorrect. Right? You might hear people saying, the ATAR is really crucially important, and if you don't get the ATAR you want, then you won't get into the course you want, therefore you won't get the job you want, therefore you won't be rich and get money, and therefore you won't ever buy a house and just have a sad life and everything will be terrible. Right? That's absolutely not the case. So I encourage you to think of the ATAR within its limited confines of utility. Now, in terms of what it actually is, though, the important thing to realize is the ATAR, so ATAR stands for Australian Tertiary Admissions Rank. And in my opinion, at least, that final word, rank, is arguably the most important. I say that because even though you might hear ATAR score bandied around, it's not really a score, at least not in the traditional sense. What I mean by that is, let's say between now and the time that ATARs are released, you achieve 80% on every single assessment across every single one of your subjects. Even if you get 80% across every single assessment, that does not necessarily mean you'll get an ATAR of 80. That would be a really simple and easy and straightforward way of doing it, but it's not the way that it works. That's because what an ATAR of 80 actually indicates is not a percentage, but a percentile rank. Basically, it shows your place in context of your competition. So an ATAR of 80 suggests you've outperformed 80% of your competition. And in this context, your competition is other QCE students who are eligible for an ATAR. So equally, an ATAR of 65 would mean you've outperformed 65%, an ATAR of 95 would mean you've outperformed 95%, and so on. So again, it's a percentile rank, not a score as such. Now, the ATAR goes from basically, well, at least close to 0 to 100, but not 100 actually. So it's 0 to 99.95. 99.95 is the highest ATAR you can receive. If you receive an ATAR of 30 or less, it's simply reported as less than 30. So the scale you're looking at is from less than 30 on one hand, all the way up to 99.95 on the other hand. And those scores, those ATARs go up and down in increments of 0.05. So the highest you can get is 99.95, then goes down to 99.9, 99.85, 99.8, all the way down to less than 30. So why is an ATAR of 100 not possible? Well, a theoretical ATAR of 100 would mean that that student has outperformed 100% of her or his or their competition. And that's not realistically possible because that competition actually includes yourself, and you can't really outperform yourself or those who you equal. So the highest is 99.95. And you'll see here that at least compared with the ATAR, at least compared with the OP, there are so many possible results. In fact, it's a 2,000 point scale, 2,000 possible ATARs, which makes it very, very specific and therefore a pretty accurate indication of overall performance. Now, in order to be eligible for the ATAR, there are a few things you must do, including the things on the slide, but not limited to those things. If you want a really detailed description of what's required, QTAC explains it very well on their website. However, you must satisfactorily complete an English subject. That doesn't necessarily have to be mainstream English. There are a number of English subjects you can choose from. And by satisfactorily, I mean averaging at least a C. Now, that might seem kind of unfair to some people, the fact that you have to do an English subject but don't have to do subjects from other fields, which is a valid concern. But if it makes it any easier or any less stressful for you, that English subject does not necessarily have to contribute to your ATAR. So even though you must satisfactorily complete it, doesn't necessarily have to contribute to your ATAR. And I'll look at that more in a moment. The reason for that is that the ATAR is calculated from your best 5 final subject scores. So if English is not included in that, it doesn't necessarily have to count. In terms of the makeup of those 5 subject scores, you actually have a few different options. It's quite flexible at QCE level. So the first option is simply to do 5 general subjects, and the general QCE subjects are kind of the most common ones. You can also do 4 general subjects and 1 applied subject, or alternatively 4 general subjects and 1 Certificate 3 or higher VET qualification. Now, we'll look at each of these in a little bit more detail, but what this shows is you have flexibility in the way that you make up your QCE study program. In terms of score calculation though, let's say there was a student who studied these 6 subjects. So bio, psych, English, legal methods, and geography. Pretty good range of subjects, and they do consistently well across the year. So you can see their scores here, 78 in bio, 70 in psych, 65 in English, all the way down to 56 in geography. Now that's not necessarily a bad score, but as you can see, it's this particular student's 6th best. That is, it's not in their top 5 subjects. And as a result, it does not contribute to the ATAR at all. Now, students might study more than 5 subjects for a number of reasons. Maybe personal interest, maybe as a university prerequisite they need to complete certain subjects, maybe simply as a buffer so that they don't necessarily have to rely on 5 specific subjects. Regardless, in this particular situation, only the top 5 will count. So at this point, we know that your top 5 subjects count toward the ATAR. Those subjects are out of 100. And your ATAR is on a scale of less than 30 to 99.95, up and down in increments of 0.05. But how are these individual subject scores calculated? For example, how do we get to 78 for biology as opposed to 70 for psychology? Very good question. Well, what we know with subject scores is they're out of 100, and there's a difference between your raw results, that is the marks you get on your tests and assessments, and what actually contributes to the ATAR. What actually contributes to the ATAR is something called your scaled result for each subject. Subject scores come from both internal assessments and external assessment, at least for the majority of general subjects. We'll look at this more in a moment. Now, let's break it down into the subject types. So in this case, we'll look at general QCE subjects. General QCE subjects mostly come from 3 internal assessments and 1 external assessment. So what's the difference? Well, the internal assessments will be pretty similar to any tests you've done through lower high school. So they will be administered by your school, you'll do them at your school. The external assessment, however, is different and might be new to quite a lot of QCE students. Basically, let's take the example of biology. Let's say you're doing bio. At the end of year 12, every single student studying biology in the state, across the entire state, no matter what school they're at, will sit the exact same exam at the exact same time. So it's a standardized assessment, and that is not administered by your school. Now, depending on the type of kind of QCE subject, that's going to dictate how important in terms of weighting the internal assessments are as opposed to the external assessments. So as you can see, for math and science subjects, there's a 50-50 split. So that final external assessment contributes half of the entire subject score. So it's pretty considerable. For other subjects, there's a bit of a different split. So internal assessments are 75%, and that external assessment is 25%. So that will be for your Englishes, humanities, creative arts, things like that. So that's general subjects. Again, heavier weighting on the exams for math and science. If we duck over to applied subjects though, these are a little bit different. As mentioned by QCAR, they're better suited to students who are kind of more interested in pathways beyond secondary schooling that lead to vocational education and training or work. The important thing to know with applied subjects is a maximum of 1 can contribute to your ATAR. So you can't do just 5 applied subjects, for example, and then expect to qualify for the ATAR. You will not be eligible. So a maximum of 1 can contribute to the ATAR. And assessment is also a little bit different. There's no external assessment. It's 100% internal. Mostly what that looks like is 1 additional internal assessment. So there'll be 4 instead of 3. Then we have vet qualifications, which are a little bit different. Again, these must be certificates 3 or higher, so Cert 3, Cert 4, diploma, and so on. And again, these work a little bit differently. Now, even the fact that you can do a vet qualification as part of your QCE study load is pretty cool. Obviously, you get to the end of the year, not only with your QCE, hopefully, but also a vet qualification. but assessment and scores work a little bit differently. So each level of qualification, so for example, all certificate 3s will contribute to the ATAR in the same way or the same amount. And that's irrespective of what you're actually studying in that certificate 3 or how long it takes you. So subject matter and duration are irrelevant. All that's relevant is the type of vet qualification. So all Cert 3s, for example, will contribute in the same way. Equally, all Cert 4s will contribute in the same way, all diplomas will contribute in the same way, and so on. And we don't know at this stage, or at least at time of recording, exactly how much they will contribute to the ATAR, but what we can logically guess as an educated assumption is the higher the qualification, the larger the contribution will be toward the ATAR. So theoretically, at least a diploma would contribute more than a Cert 4, which in itself will contribute more than a Cert 3, as you can see here. So what do we know so far? Well, at least for general QCE subjects, there's a 50% weighting in math and science subjects on the internal assessment and external assessment, whereas with other subjects, 75% is internal. We know that there are 3 internal assessments and 1 external assessment for general subjects. For applied subjects, it's a bit different, 4 internals and 0 externals. And of course, we know that vet qualifications are treated a little bit differently, as just discussed. Now, you might be thinking at this stage, well, with general subjects and applied subjects, they both rely, at least in part, on internal assessments, so those administered by the school. And you might be thinking, well, what if different schools administer different assessments? How is that fair? That's a really valid concern, and one that's really being considered heavily in this new ATAR system. For that reason, there are really stringent processes in place called confirmation and endorsement, basically to ensure that even though individual schools administer the assessments, they're under quite specific regulations and processes. So you can be very, very confident in the fact that irrespective of the school you go to, or the specific assessments you sit, it's pretty much even across the board, so no need to stress too much. What do those assessments actually look like though? Well, as I mentioned, each subject comes with kind of guidelines for how they should actually be assessed so that it's consistent across the state. And on the QCAR website, which, by the way, if you haven't explored so far, I'd really, really recommend doing. On the QCAR website, for each subject, you can find a section called How Will Students Be Assessed? And this gives a general overview of the kinds of assessment that you can expect. So if we have a look here, we can see 3 different subjects. We have QCE Biology, QCE English, and QCE Math Methods. As you can imagine, they're very, very different subjects. And as a result, they logically have to be treated differently in assessment. So you can see here that there is a different kind of structure for each subject, both in terms of weightings and also in terms of the actual assessment type. This is just a quick overview. Again, for more detail on each of these subjects, you should consult QCAR directly. But you can even see down the bottom there the difference between internal examinations and also external examinations for each subject. So again, key points here, both internal assessments and external assessments matter, at least for general subjects. In other states, and what will definitely be the case in Queensland as well, is you'll hear different things from different students or tutors. Things like, don't worry about internal assessments, it's all about the external exam. Or vice versa, don't worry too much about the external exam, it's all about the internal assessments. But as you can see from the actual weightings, in some cases they're exactly equal, and in other cases there's a 75-25 split. But irrespective of what subject it is, both internal assessment and external assessment matters to a degree. And that's not to say that you should be stressing out about, every single assessment to the point of poor health or anything like that. But the point is that consistency will be your friend. So if you just try your best within the limits of your abilities and motivation throughout the entire year, you'll be in a really good position. Whereas if you don't really try or don't really kind of extend yourself throughout the year and leave everything for the external exam, for example, then you won't be in such a good position in order to do well. We also know that the subject scores for each subject are out of 100. But what happens then? Right, once we've looked at the internal assessment marks and the external assessment marks, can we just leave it as whatever that score is out of 100? Again, this would be an easy way of doing things, but it's not the way that we treat QCE subjects. And the reason for that is that there are other factors at play. We need something called inter-subject scaling. But before I go on to explain scaling and its impact and the way that it functions, I just want to note that this is probably the trickiest concept which we'll cover. And as a result, I just want to mention the ATAR Notes forums, because if after this you have any questions whatsoever, the best way to contact me will be via the forums. So as you can see here, atarnotes.com/forum, you can scroll down to the QCE stuff, so the QCE section, and we have dedicated sections for different types of QCE subjects. For example, if we duck into the English boards and then English, you can see guides, and there's a question thread where you can ask whatever question you like. So you might come in here and then scroll all the way down. And then there's a quick reply box where you can just type whatever you want and post it, and then somebody will respond to you. So we have a section for each QCE subject, but we also, more relevantly for now, we also have a technical score discussion section. So if you click into that, you'll see some guides on things similar to what we're covering today. Joseph41, this here is me, even though my name is Nick. Don't ask, it's a long story. But we also have a questions section as well, where you can do the same thing and clarify anything that we've gone through today, or in fact, just anything at all that you're curious about the new ATAR system. So with that in mind, let's go on to inter-subject scaling. And as I mentioned, it is one of the more complicated, areas of the new QCE system. Stick with me as much as you can. If you go through the actual publicly available documents from QTAC on the matter, you'll see that it's a pretty complicated process mathematically. I'm admittedly not much of a math kind of guy, didn't study it too much after high school, but it is quite complex. And so what I'm doing here is to try to give you a basic overview of the processes involved and functionally how it works in more kind of day-to-day language. So fingers crossed. Now, the key or fundamental issue with QCE is this. There are so many different QCE subjects that you can choose from, which is awesome for you in terms of subject selection. It gives you great flexibility. However, it comes with the inherent flaw that each of those QCE subjects is unique, and they're fundamentally different to other subjects. So we had the example of methods and bio and English earlier. If you imagine trying to compare those subjects, it's really, really difficult to do. So we have something called scaling to account for that. And straight off the bat, scaling does not reward or punish you for studying certain subjects. In fact, the whole point of scaling is to make everything an even playing field. And the benefit of this is that you can simply choose subjects that you enjoy, that you're good at, that you're passionate about, or that you need for university. And I say this as somebody who went through high school. I studied 6 subjects in year 12, 5 of them scaled down. And through year 12, when I was a student, I was really pent up with rage, thinking, oh, this is so unjust, so unfair. But now, on reflection, now that I've been through the system, I can understand and appreciate that it actually was really fair. And hopefully I'll be able to explain to you why that's the case. And to do that, I want to start with an example or a bit of an analogy. So let's say we had two fictional QCE subjects. We have QCE darts and QCE Sudoku, and only now do I realize that's a picture of a crossword, not a Sudoku, but stick with me. So darts and Sudoku. And we also have two QCE students. So one's called Alex and the other one's called Billy. And they both get a 70 in their respective subjects. So Alex gets a 70 in darts and Billy gets a 70 in Sudoku. And my question to you to contemplate for the next few seconds is that achievement equally impressive? Is Alex's 70 in darts the same or equivalent to Billy's 70 in Sudoku? Well, based on the information we have at the moment, which is very limited, we're kind of forced into saying, well, yeah, they seem equally impressive, right? The number is the same, both got 70. That's essentially all we know. However, in reality, we actually know more than that. We know that some subjects might be easier to score well in or harder to score well in, and we need to account for that fact. But we can't base judgment or scaling simply on what is, quote, harder, unquote, because that's really, really subjective. Right? I might be doing English and find it really, really easy, whereas you find English really, really hard. But on the flip side, you're doing math and find it really, really easy, whereas I'm doing math and find it really, really hard. So we need something more objective, and something more objective that we can actually find or ascertain is how competitive those subjects are. Essentially, how difficult it is to rank, say, first in a subject as opposed to first in another subject. So to do that, or to find that out, we need more context. For example, if I gave this further context for our previous example, immediately our perception changes, right? If we know that Alex's 70 in darts is the highest score in that subject across the entire state, and Billy's 70 in Sudoku is the lowest score across anybody studying Sudoku in the entire state, immediately our perception changes. So that 70 in darts from Alex becomes really, really impressive. It's the highest in the entire state. But Billy's 70 in Sudoku becomes way less impressive, right? It's the lowest in the entire state. And all of a sudden, it doesn't seem fair or just to award both of them 70 when one ranked really, really highly and the other one ranked really, really lowly. Right? So we need some other kind of system in place. And to do that, we can find something called percentile rankings. So essentially, we take a raw score from a subject and see where that places you in context of everybody else studying that subject in the state. So let's take this table of example, and please, please, please be aware that all of the numbers from this point onward are totally fictional and made up simply for sake of demonstration or example. I really don't want to get to a point where people are taking this as a prediction, for example, on what subjects will scale well and what subjects will scale down. In reality, just for complete transparency, nobody knows, and nobody will know until the first data of student performance at the end of 2020. Right? We can make guesses, maybe based on things like what scales well in other states and whatnot, but in actuality, we do not know, and we're only guessing until the end of 2020. And even when we get that data, that will only provide some kind of indication, right? The thing with scaling is it changes year to year to year, because as hopefully you'll see by the end of this presentation, it's based solely and 100% on student performance. So with that proviso out there, let's continue. So if you have a look at this student's results, 91 in English, 82 in methods, 75 in legal, so on and so forth. What we do is we take, for example, that 91 in English and compare the 91 in English to everybody else studying English across the state. And what we might find is the 91 in English, for example, might place them at the 92nd percentile across the state. That is, they outperformed 92% of their competition. Whereas an 82 in methods might have meant that they outperformed 85% of their competition, and so on. And you can see those new scores in that third column of the table. What you might notice is, again, in this totally made up fictional example, a raw 75 in legal studies placed that student at the 72nd percentile, but a raw 70 in physics also placed them at the 72nd percentile. And the idea here is we can now say, well, at least approximately a 75 raw in legal is pretty similar or comparable to a 70 raw in physics, because it placed that student at the 72nd percentile in each case. Now that we have these percentiles for each raw score, these basically become the first round of scaled results. Great, so now we have scaled scores, right? Well, we're only part of the way there. We can actually become way more specific than that. Right, so far what we've done is we've accounted for where results place students in context of a certain subject. But what we haven't considered yet is the fact that some subjects it'll be easier to rank highly than in other subjects. Essentially, in some subjects, it'll be easier to get, say, the 95th percentile than in others. And a big part of that is the competition. So again, using a bit of a different analogy, let's say both you and your best friend, you're both running a 100-meter sprint. You're both involved in a 100-meter running race. It just so happens that in your race, you're competing against Usain Bolt and Tyson Gay and all these other professional sprinters who have been doing it for years and years and years, and they've dedicated their lives to essentially running quickly. Whereas in the second race, your friend is competing against toddlers and people who they have an obvious physical advantage over. Now, it's important to note here that you're both running the same race insofar as you're both running 100 meters. It's the same distance. The only thing that's different here is the competition. Now, let's say that in your race, you run the 100 meters in 12 seconds flat. Good for you. But that places you last in that particular race. Whereas in the second race, your friend also runs the 100 meters in 12 seconds flat. Good for them. But that places them first. Now, it doesn't really seem just or fair that you'll be ranked very, very lowly in that race or in that QCE subject, whereas your friend would be ranked very, very highly in their race or in their QCE subject, remembering that your actual level of achievement running the race in 12 seconds flat was exactly the same. So to counter this, we need to better account for the competition, essentially the type of students who are in each subject. And to do that, we need to find something called the Polyrank. Stick with me. Now, essentially the Polyrank provides an overall indication of QCE performance across all of your subjects. The Polyrank is calculated by looking at your top 5 scaled subjects and finding the average of those top 5 scaled results. So taking the example from earlier, remembering that we had those that new round of scaled scores based on percentiles in the third column, we find the average of those results, and this particular student's Polyrank is 74.4. Great. What does that mean? How is it used? Well, what we do is we find for every single score, for every single subject, we find the average Polyrank of students who achieve that score. So if we go back to the 91 raw in English, we find across the entire state everybody who achieved a 91 raw in English, and we find their average Polyrank. So put them all together, divide by the number of students, and in this case, again, totally made up numbers, the average Polyrank might be, say, 94.5. And we can repeat that process for every score across every subject. For example, looking at everybody who achieved an 82 raw in math methods, we might find that that pool of students, their average Polyrank was 89.9, and we repeat the process all the way down the list. Now, that's great. What we now have is an updated and indeed more accurate round of scaled scores. So this fourth column supersedes the third column. That fourth column becomes the updated study scores. Great. So now we have scaled results, which not only look at percentiles based on where you kind of finish within a subject, but they also look at competition. So we're done, right? Well, no, we've still got another couple of steps. What we can now do is, now that we have an updated round of scaled scores, is we can actually find an updated Polyrank. Remembering that what the Polyrank is the average of your top 5 scaled results. So now that we have new scaled results, we can recalculate the Polyrank. And in this case, for example, the Polyrank for this particular student might have changed from 74.4 to 76.02. Cool. But now that we have a new Polyrank, we can recalculate the average Polyrank of every score across every subject. So we can essentially repeat that same process. So now we look at everybody who achieved a raw 91 in English, for example, and find the average Polyrank based on that updated round of Polyranks. What you might realize here is it's what's called an iterative process. So once we have a new round of Polyranks, we can recalculate the scaled scores. But once we have new scaled scores, we can recalculate the Polyrank. But once we have a new Polyrank, we can update the scaled scores, which means we can update the Polyrank, which means we can update the scaled scores, which means we can update the Polyrank, and so on. This repeats until the process flattens out, essentially until there's very negligible change between rounds of scaled scores. And when this happens, we settle on a final round. Now that final round of scaled scores will be quite specific. It will go to the second decimal place. And if you add up your top 5 scaled results, you'll find something called the aggregate. So in this case, 382.73. We can then use the aggregate to rank every single student from best to worst across the entire state based on their aggregate. Now that aggregate will be pretty accurate because it's based on the final scale results for the top 5 subjects, which, remember, take into account not only your percentile in terms of performance across each subject, but it also takes into account competition through the Polyrank. So once we've ranked all of the aggregates from highest to lowest, we can find the ATAR. Essentially, the top pool of ATARs will be attributed the top ATAR. The next pool will be contributed the next best ATAR, so 99.9. Then the next pool will be attributed 99.85, all the way down in increments of 0.05. So, key points here. The ATAR is not a score, at least not in the traditional sense. It's a percentile rank, and it ranges from less than 30 to 99.95, up and down in increments of 0.05. And it's based on your top 5 subjects. Importantly, those 5 subjects are after scaling. They're out of 100. They're based both on internal assessment and external assessment for general subjects. As we know, applied subjects and vet qualifications are treated a little bit differently. Again, as we know, subject scores are scaled not to reward or punish you, but so that we can accurately measure and compare levels of achievement across subjects. Because of scaling, you should be able to choose subjects that you're interested in, passionate about, need for uni, so on and so forth, as opposed to selecting subjects based on scaling, which I promise you is not a good idea. The reason for that is, let's say you choose subject X because you've heard on the grapevine that it scales really, really well. Maybe that it scales up 10 points or something like that. Granted, you'll theoretically benefit from the scaling, but what that scaling is actually doing is just negating the fact that it was difficult to get a good rank in that subject in the first place. The same is kind of true of the opposite. So if you're studying a subject that scales down by 10 points, yeah, you're kind of negatively affected by the downward scaling, but what that's actually doing is just negating the fact that it was easier to get a good rank in the first place. So hopefully what's become clear is scaling is not really good or bad. It just negates how competitive a particular subject was. Now, after that scaling process, you'll have a final scaled subject score for each of your top 5 subjects. And if we add those up, we kind of get your total QCE high score, which is the aggregate. And the aggregate is then used to find the final percentile rank, which is your ATAR. Hopefully that makes it a little bit clearer. I understand that a lot of that might not have been super clear the first time. And you can watch and rewatch this video as many times as you need, or indeed, as I mentioned, message me on the forums, make a post on the forums. If you need help with that, please feel free to contact us. Or otherwise, get involved with TuteSmart, which is tutoring by ATAR Notes. And the people running these TuteSmart classes not only are experts on the ATAR and everything kind of technical side of QCE, but also on their particular subject matter. And TuteSmart's really cool because you get the weekly 90-minute classes for your subject. All of them are recorded and uploaded online, so similar to this, you can watch and rewatch them as many times as you need. And you also get exclusive online resources and access to your tutors and things like that. If you're interested in TuteSmart, all the classes are held at QUT, so the same place as our free lectures, and you can try TuteSmart out for a couple of weeks with no commitment at the link on screen, so just tutesmart.com/enroll. Again, if you have any questions about this whatsoever, please do feel free to get in contact. Thank you so much for joining us for this first video. Again, the next video in this series will be based on maximizing your marks, so study tips and study techniques to help you through QCE, things that you can implement right now to increase your marks. And I hope to see you then. Thanks so much.